Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom.
Matt, you had a blog post this week, which you called a Bonkers sanctions case. It was certainly interesting. We're going to call it Fracht. And so why don't you tell us about this?
Sure. So this came from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, last week. Fined a freight forwarding company known as Fracht, FWO. They are based down in Houston, and they were sanctioned $1.6 million for a sanctions compliance violation. They were doing business with a customer, or rather a supplier, I think, that they should not have been doing business with. But what is interesting here are two things. A, usually when you and I are talking about sanctions enforcement, it's about violations that happened over a period of time. You know, company X was selling technology to China for 18 months and it shouldn't have done that. Or cryptocurrency firm Z didn't perform due diligence and was letting customers in Cuba and North Korea do transactions for some period of time. It's stuff like that. This action against Fracht is not like that. This action against Fracht involved one specific deal, a very lucrative deal, and we can talk about that later on, but it was one deal that Fracht brokered in 2022 that basically compliance was cut out of what this deal was. And so Fracht wound up contracting, it is a freight forwarder, so they were working in Mexico with the customer there who needed goods to go to Argentina. Fracht wound up contracting with an airline, an air freight service, to move the goods, but the air service was a subsidiary of the Venezuelan National Airlines, which is under sanctions, so that's bad. And then, unknown to Fracht, once it contracted with the Venezuelans, who it shouldn't have done business with, the Venezuelans subcontracted the project out to another Air Force air forwarding service from Iran. So I was like, what are we doing here, people? We have third-party and fourth-party risks. We have a lucrative deal where compliance was kept on the sidelines. Fracht did win a lot of credit from OFAC in its settlement for everything it had done post-incident. And a lot of the remediation is worth talking about on how Fracht did bring compliance back into these business processes. But it was a deal that's rather unusual in a transaction that I think involves 5 different countries, if I'm counting correctly. And the idea that you deal with one foreign prohibited entity, which then subcontracts out to an even worse prohibited entity like that, that's a really interesting bank shot of misconduct I was not expecting to see.
Matt, I have to say the unusual nature of the transaction for me started with two things. One thing you mentioned and one thing you highlighted in your blog post. You mentioned the lucrative nature of it, but also the speed in which it had to occur.
Yes.
It was almost, hey, it's Friday afternoon at 4, we need this Monday sort of situation. And those are two huge red flags that should have alerted multiple people within the company that something was very unusual was going on here. So I just wanted to highlight that for the compliance professional because it struck me that the whole deal stank from the get-go. And the get-go was, we need it tomorrow and we're going to pay you a ton of money to do it.
I think that is very true. And Tom, your idea that this sounds like the sort of thing you get a call on Friday, we need it done by Monday. I'd have to go back and check the calendar, but that might actually be the timeline here, because let's walk through what the transaction actually was. There was a Mexican auto parts manufacturer that needed goods shipped to Argentina. And the Mexican manufacturer was dealing with a Fracht affiliate in Mexico that could not get this deal done. So that Mexican affiliate called up Fracht in the United States and said, can you guys help us? So Fracht then gets pulled into this Mexico deal. This was happening at the end of May, and I don't know exactly how late in May, but the deal, the shipping had to happen on June 2nd of 2022. So your point about, they call you on a Friday, we need this done by Monday, it could have been that. But clearly within only a week or two, they needed to pull all this together. So Fracht winds up they find an air freight forwarding service that they were going to work with to get these auto parts from Mexico to Argentina. Now, that the names matter here, so let me make sure that I can dig them up. The air forwarder that they found was known in Spanish as Emtrasur. Emtrasur was a subsidiary of the Venezuelan national airline, which is Conviva, I think it is. It is Conviasa. So Conviasa is on the U.S. sanctions list. You are not allowed to do business with Conviasa, and that is known. And they had subcontracted with this Emtrasur, which is a subsidiary of Conviasa. So that was violation number one. Now, where was the compliance team at this point? According to the allegations laid out in the OFAC settlement, they were nowhere. The vice presidents of air freight deliberately turned a blind eye to or ignored, or there were no compliance due diligence checks to find out this supplier we have, Emtrasur, who are they? Who owns them? And none of that happened. So they booked this and they arranged it. Then it gets weirder. We haven't even gotten to the Iran detail yet. There's a middle weirdness here, is that of course, it's this hurry up thing that we have to do. June 2nd rolls around and everything is late by a couple of days. Now, this matters because Emtrasur says, look, we can still do it, but it's going to be an extra $100 and some odd thousand in late fees and rush fees to get this done. That prompted a flurry of discussion among Fracht people here in the United States, at which point they were saying, they were actually knowing there are email records of them talking about, text message records of them talking about how Emtrasur is owned by Conviasa, and at least two vice presidents at Fracht knew that Conviasa was on the sanctions entity list, and therefore so was Emtrasur, and you're not supposed to use them. And they knew it. They said it. It was in a text message. The CEO of the company apparently was involved in those discussions, although all evidence suggests, according to OFAC, the CEO didn't know that Conviasa was a sanctioned entity, but they decide we're going to pay the extra fee, we're going to have this rush job done, and we're going to do it. Fine. Conviasa and Emtrasur then turn around and subcontract the actual execution of this, the plane being flown and the air crew flying the plane, to a business known as Mahan Air, which is owned by Iran. And Mahan Air is also on the sanctioned entity list in the United States, and you can't do business with them either. Now, all evidence, again, suggests that Fracht didn't know Conviasa had done this and pulled in the Iran people until after the fact. However, it was the Iranians working under the Conviasa flag who finally did take the goods that had all been arranged by Fracht from Mexico to Argentina. But there are a lot of due diligence red flags that were completely ignored. On the contract, it said Conviasa. On the contract, Emtrasur listed its home address as being in Venezuela. The flight manifest had a stopover in Venezuela. And the Fracht executives, two vice presidents at least, and more people, they all saw this. They all knew this. And they knew that Emtrasur and Conviasa were sanctioned entities. They did the business anyways. Only after the fact, and the goods were finally in Argentina, did they understand that they also had been dealing with an Iranian airline. That seemed to get them to pull the fire alarm. And at that point, they tried to start rectifying the situation. They did self-report this incident to OFAC, except OFAC had already known this. I don't know how OFAC became aware of it, but that means that they did not get voluntary self-disclosure credit, Fracht, because OFAC had already known. They did do a good job at remediation. We can talk about all that, but is this bizarro thing where, are you kidding me? You do a business with one sanctioned entity that then subcontracts to another sanctioned entity? I've never heard that in all of my years in this field. It's nuts.
One of the other things that struck me, Matt, was that we had high-level executives in the company who knowingly violated doing business with sanctions entities.
Yes.
And recognized that. And I was trying to think of another case where we had such clear senior management involvement in this, and maybe you're about to tell me that's what happens every time, Tom. But typically we have a little bit lower level people doing the nefarious acts that somehow are either getting approved or looked the other way by senior management. But here we had senior management making the calls.
We had one vice president who put this into motion. Then we had another vice president who got into the mess once things were getting delayed and they weren't sure if they were going to pay the extra fee or not. That led to this flurry of messages among multiple Fracht employees, including the CEO, where I can dig it up now here. One Fracht vice president expressly told Fracht's CEO that Emtrasur was a sub-company of Conviasa, the sanctioned Venezuelan airline. Supposedly, apparently, the CEO did not grasp that Conviasa was sanctioned and Emtrasur, their business partner, was a subsidiary. The CEO didn't know that there were sanctions involved here, but the vice presidents who were involved, they knew it, and they knew that Emtrasur and Conviasa were going to be their business partners. They knew also that was a violation of sanctions law. The CEO knew the names of the companies, but didn't know that they were on the sanctions list. Nobody knew that Mahan Air would be the subcontracted fourth party that gets involved until after the fact. And that seems to be what triggered everything here. But yes, if you look through at the aggravating factors that OFAC finally listed in its settlement, one of the aggravating factors was that senior executives had direct knowledge that they were dealing with a sanctioned company. And that's all there is to say about it. They knew it there.
Let's go to the remediation efforts because you detailed those, I thought, very well in the blog post, but also really once the company got religion, they started singing to the choir.
They did. And so before we get to the remediation, let's just appreciate, I think, the fundamental problems here were that the compliance team, such that it was, and I get the sense that maybe it was not very aggressively manned and there wasn't a lot of personnel there, but however many personnel there were or weren't involved in sanctions at the time, they were not involved in this deal. They were on the sidelines or cut out or deliberately misled. I'm not clear on exactly how, but this was a very lucrative deal that the business put together without consulting the compliance team and without going through the proper compliance checks. How many times have we heard that before? We've heard it in FCPA land, and now we hear it here in sanctions land too. That was the fundamental problem. Compliance could not get involved in a lucrative, high-pressure, high turnaround deal. But then number two, also, Fracht didn't have much visibility down the supply chain because even the ones who did know that they were violating sanctions, they didn't know that they were violating it twice over by having the subcontracted Iranians as part of this. So it is another reminder about the contract management capabilities you need, the visibility down the supply chain you need, that your third parties should bring it to your attention if they are going to subcontract to a fourth party so that you can also then find out, is this fourth party problematic, which for Fracht it was, and they didn't know. But how do you get compliance involved? And how do you make sure that you can see all the way down your transaction chain to everybody who's involved to make sure that some distant, nth level party problematic supplier reaches up from beyond the grave to whack your company with the violation risk, which is what happened here.
Matt, before you go on, could I ask you, were you able to determine from your review of the order whether or not the entire transaction was done outside the normal course of business, meaning compliance had no visibility and nothing to do with it, or meaning it was outside of a process that was established, or they had no process?
I don't know if they had no process at all, or they had a weak process, or they did have a process and this didn't happen outside of it. I don't know which of those three it was, except that compliance was not involved in performing due diligence on this deal. That is said in the OFAC settlement documents. Now, was compliance not involved because compliance was understaffed, because it had a terrible process, because people were deceiving and hiding this lucrative transaction from compliance? I couldn't quite glean from that. However, if you look at the remediation, we see a lot of talk about hiring more compliance staffers, investing more compliance resources and personnel, spending more money. We see a lot about giving compliance new oversight powers where deals can't happen unless compliance is involved. Now, that is what Fracht has done in the last 3 years since this deal had happened. I don't know what we're supposed to take away from all that about what was Fracht's compliance posture before all this at the preliminaries. Did they not have enough sanctions people? Did they have no sanctions people? Was compliance just completely sidelined and ignored? I don't know. I can't answer that question.
How about any, if we turn to the remediation, any consequences for at least the two VPs we detailed, or maybe even the CEO? Were you able to glean anything on the what we now call consequence management side of things?
We do know that the VP who put all of this into motion, he or she got fired. There were other personnel consequences, but I am not clear on exactly what those consequences are. But here are some of the mitigation steps that Fracht has taken. So number one, there's now a mandate that all contracts from customers and freight providers, they are subject to legal review and sanctions due diligence prior to execution. So I assume, therefore, that means this was not in place at the time of the Mexico deal, because they have since put it into place. Number two, for air freight cargo deals, such as the one that caused all of this, Fracht now has templates to include confirmation of compliance with U.S. sanctions. I think that gets to making sure your third parties don't subcontract to a fourth party who might be from Iran or somewhere else. They have updated their vendor onboarding procedures so that all vendors are subject to the compliance functions approval and sanctions-focused due diligence. That's nice. Like, you can't bring on vendors until compliance has given its blessing. That is how you make compliance an empowered part of the business process. I like to see that. There are implementing now, there are new quarterly reporting requirements and compliance training for employees who are dealing with all of these freight forwarders. We should remember that Fracht and the business it's in, global shipping, there are a lot of contractors and subcontractors and vendors and subcontractors and whatnot. So a lot of training that needs to happen to make sure that those employees, Fracht these days does about $1 billion in revenue, according to its website. Those employees must also now be trained. Fracht must now submit an annual certification to OFAC, signed by a senior level executive, but we don't exactly know who that person is. We don't know if it's compliance officer or somebody else, but they have to make annual certifications for 5 years that they have been implementing and are enforcing and upholding their new compliance program. They have hired at least 9 compliance employees in the last couple of years. They're spending at least $1 million a year on compliance. So they're putting resources in there. And if you go to Fracht's website today, they have a whole new spiffy, in-depth section about their dedication to compliance. And you can see their code of conduct for themselves. You can see their code of conduct for their suppliers, and I assume that means suppliers of physical goods the business needs, but also suppliers of services. There's a lot of agent-like entities that work for Fracht, the freight forwarders and organizers and whatnot, expediters. So there's a lot of sanctions and third-party and agent risk that Fracht deals with. It's not quite the anti-corruption agent risk that FCPA people deal with, but I think you could recognize some of the DNA of what the risk is, that these are agents you don't necessarily know who they are or how their business practices are, and you need to find that out. So Fracht has been making this concerted effort to put compliance into that process and to give them more, I'll say, veto control over problematic vendors and suppliers, so that they don't get into this chain of transactions like what happened here with Mexico and Argentina and Venezuela and Iran and everybody else.
So we had a lot going on here. Is, with the lessons that you've been able to glean from this case, do you think this is closer to a sort of a rare action where we had so many different mistakes, or this is just sort of par for the course?
I don't know, but to a certain extent, I suppose I don't even care, because we often see stories of weak compliance programs, weak sanctions compliance programs that exist for a long time. And there's this series of small, questionable transactions that get all rolled up into an enforcement action from OFAC that says, like, company X, you did this for 18 months or 12 years or 6 years or whatever, and you did 58 transactions, and this is terrible, and here's your enforcement. I've seen so many cases like that. I have not seen a case that drilled down on one specific transaction that was very lucrative, that was very descriptive and demonstrative in how this all came together. Comes together very quickly. Decisions have to be made very quickly. High lucrative deal, but it's all happening in the space of a couple of weeks. And there's a lot there that just shows how compliance officers can be sidelined, and then what Fracht has done to make sure they're not sidelined now and they're brought in. They have a rather lengthy settlement document that talks about all of the compliance program improvements Fracht has made and must continue to uphold for at least the next 5 years. But Tom, there's one other part of this settlement. I'll just read it out. It's a couple of sentences that I think is a good clarion call for everybody else. This is what OFAC said about the significance of this case. Quote, "This enforcement action emphasizes the importance for international trade service providers, such as freight forwarders, to know their counterparties and recognize the risks of prioritizing urgent business demands at the expense of compliance. In a complex operating environment, it is critical for all persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction, including senior personnel responding to urgent commercial needs, to understand the potential sources of sanctions risk and take appropriate steps to prevent potential violations." Close quote. That's a really neat one-paragraph encapsulation of why this all matters. Complex organization, a lot of moving parts, senior people who want to close a lucrative deal real fast and trample right over compliance. Don't do it. OFAC is going to watch, and we want everybody to respect and pay attention to compliance issues, even when that's hard. That's what that paragraph means. And that's a good message to send. It is a telling thing. Compliance officers should print it out and, staple it to the forehead of your business operations and to your audit committee to make sure that they know the urgency of this matter.
Matt, that seems like a great point for us to end on. I can't wait to see what we can come up with next week.
Thank you, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.